Hello and welcome back. So today I'm going to be talking about the Revolutionary War. Well, not exactly the Revolutionary War. I'm going to be talking about whether or not Britain should have been scared of America in 1776 before the majority of the war had kicked off. So first of all, I'm going to be looking at the disparity between the army and the navy. So the British actually had a much stronger army on paper. They had approximately a population of 8 million people, which did dwarf that of America. They had more than 300 ships in the Royal Navy, and nominally they had 50,000 regulars in their army, complemented by 18,000 German mercenaries. However, at this point in time, the British Army was actually undermanned. So only around 36,000 active personnel at this point in time. And they were also untested since the Seven Years' War. Also in the run up to 1776, the British had allowed their Royal Navy to be in decay to avoid provoking France to war. And on top of this, the British didn't have any inspirational leaders or a cause to rally around, unlike the Americans. And on paper, the Americans also have a much weaker military because they didn't actually have a standing army, which is unlike the British. So this had to be built from scratch. And the soldiers that were enlisted to the American army would only be kept for short periods of time. So continuity through campaigns was very difficult to maintain. And the American Navy was also incredibly small compared to the Royal Navy. So they had no hope of contesting the seas. But on the other hand, the Patriots, those are the Americans fighting for independence, they were very dedicated to the cause of American independence and therefore would fight with much higher morale than perhaps a British soldier who questioned his position in America. And militiamen who fought for America were also much easier to recruit across the colonies, and so they could turn out in large numbers to scenes of action or battle and would intimidate loyalists. So, loyalists are Americans who would have stayed loyal to Britain and fought for Britain. And on top of this, large proportions of the population were actually patriots or just neutral for that fact rather than loyalists. So, in all, on the military side, the Americans did have more possibility for militiamen to be recruited in large numbers, but it didn't actually offset the disparity in discipline between professional British soldiers and themselves. So, if applied correctly, the British would understandably have thought that they could easily crush an untrained militia. And though the British Navy was in deterioration, it was orders of magnitude larger than anything the Americans could actually muster up. And so domination of the seas would seem inevitable. Foreign influences. So British had support from some Native American tribes, and these Native American tribes would have known the territory that they came from a lot better than anyone else would have. And this would have given the British an advantage if it came to either open battle in the region or even just the suppression of patriot activities or rebellions. But on the other hand, Native American land was slightly further afield from where the British were mainly going to be fighting, which would be cities or towns rather in 13 colonies. So there was a much stronger patriot presence in the areas of action compared to Native Americans. So this advantage is somewhat decreased. And for America, the French and Spanish were actually giving covert support to them because they both had a bone to pick with Britain after their defeat in the Seven Years' War. Now, France actually has a population of about 25 million at this point, which is much larger than both Britain and America. And Spain also has colonies quite close to America and can provide support through those. And both France and Spain do have decently sized navies, which could help to contest Britain. And these two countries were actually quite vital for getting weapons and officers to America to build the new army. But they weren't going to be openly getting involved in this conflict in 1776. They were both very wary of Britain because of their defeat to Britain in the Seven Years' War just a few years beforehand. And France and Spain were unsure whether or not the Americans had a fighting chance and would only get involved if it became clear that the British could be defeated. This was for fear of angering the British. So, in all, foreign influence does actually still favour Britain, whilst France and Spain were covertly helping the USA. These were small levels of support because they had to be small enough kind of processes in order to try and hide it from Britain and not cause a major flashpoint in geopolitical affairs. And the British did have the support of some Native American tribes who had a vested interest in helping Britain win, actually, because Britain had actually been quite supportive of the Native Americans retaining some of their land. So you see the 1763 proclamation line, which is basically a proclamation saying that white settlers in America couldn't settle east of this line, and this land would be reserved for the Native Americans. But had America become independent at this point, the Native Americans were worried that their land would be taken by these American settlers. Geography and government. So in this war, Britain actually has a massive geographical disadvantage because America is about 4,800 kilometers away from home. Orders, reinforcements, supplies all took a long time to reach the battleground, and it meant that Britain had to rely on men on the spot. So the commanders that they sent to America would have been integral to the decisions made in terms of the war. And if these men on the spot were incompetent, it would severely hamper Britain's ability to fight the war. America did have geographical advantages in that case because they were fighting on their own turf, and in theory, they were able to much more quickly muster up recruits through militias compared to Britain. But the American government was quite weak, or at least the central government was weak at this stage because it didn't actually have the power to raise taxes to pay for the army, and it didn't have the power to keep the soldiers maintained on a long-term basis. The soldiers would only stay for a certain short amount of time. On top of this, each of the 13 states of the colony, or each of the 13 colonies or previous colonies of the United States, which had now become states, had their own agendas, and they didn't always see eye to eye with both each other or the central government for that fact. So it could cause some kind of indecision and conflict of interest. So at the start of the war, it would seem to the British that the American government did lack power to actually wage war effectively. And while the geography forced Britain to rely heavily on its commanders, they sent those commanders over there for a reason, right? Because the British would have thought that these were competent commanders who could put down an American rebellion. Obviously, later on in the war, we might not see this being the case, but that's a story for another time. So, in conclusion, yes, Britain did have a reason to be confident of military success in 1776, and it wouldn't seem as if they should be too scared of America at the point in time, because they had a professional army which was large compared to America's lack of an army. The foreign support for the Americans was very limited, and the British did have the support of a majority of Native American tribes. And the weakness of the American government and internal state division did actually outweigh British geographical weakness of fighting far from home, because it meant that the Americans couldn't actually wage an effective war on their own turf. And the Britons had sent over commanders who, in their eyes, were capable and could get the job done. Thank you for listening, and please like and subscribe. It would really help the channel. All right, see you next time.